Ladies, we need to talk about TempDrop. TempDrop gives you everything you need to effortlessly track your fertility. Wear the TempDrop sensor while you sleep for accurate temperature readings without the stress of early morning wake-ups. TempDrop's accompanying app enables you to chart an array of symptoms alongside your temperature, including cervical mucus and OPKs. Combine these fertility signs all in one place to identify your fertile window and confirm ovulation. Whether you're trying to conceive, avoiding pregnancy, or want to chart for health reasons, TempDrop makes fertility awareness accessible to all women, even if you don't have regular cycles or sleeping patterns. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/TempDrop and use coupon code FertilityFriday at checkout for 10% off your order. That's fertilityfriday.com/TempDrop. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 448. Welcome to the Fertility Friday podcast, your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I'm your host, Lisa Hendrickson-Jack. I'm the author of The Fifth Vital Sign and the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Workbook. I'm a certified fertility awareness educator and holistic reproductive health practitioner with over 20 years of experience teaching women to connect to their fifth vital sign through menstrual cycle charting, balancing hormone health, and optimizing the menstrual cycle without hormones. I have been consistently outspoken about hormonal birth control over the past 2 decades and its impact on fertility and overall health because you have the right to know how your body works and how artificial hormones disrupt that natural process. I teach women's health professionals how to utilize the menstrual cycle as a vital sign in their practices, and I host live coaching programs to help you achieve optimal fertility and health because it's important to have healthy menstrual cycles regardless of whether or not you want to have babies. I'm also a wife and mother of 2 beautiful boys and a brand new baby girl. This podcast is designed to empower you to take full control of your cycles, your fertility, and your overall health. And I'm so excited that you're here with me today. Today, I'll be doing a BBT throwdown. BBT stands for basal body temperature. So from here on in, I will be saying BBT. And I will be going through some of the most common questions that I receive about it and some of the questions also that I get about wearable devices, including the TempDrop, who is sponsoring this podcast. So I will be getting to those. So listen to the very end because that's when I will be talking about the devices. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into today's episode. All right, BBT. BBT is an interesting topic in the fertility awareness world because I think the majority of women are familiar with the symptothermal method. I would say the majority of my clients and the majority of practitioners tend toward the symptothermal method, which is a combination of cervical mucus charting, BBT, and other signs, including cervical position and other secondary signs. However, it is important to recognize that there are methods that are used without the BBT, and there are actually practitioners who discourage the use of BBT. So it can be helpful to understand why. So before we get into some of the most common questions, I think it's helpful to just go over that and be aware of that. So one of the reasons that some practitioners and some methods avoid the use of BBT is because BBT is variable. It changes and fluctuates based on a variety of different factors that are happening in your life. Now, I would argue that that is one of the reasons that makes BBT a really helpful measure, especially when you're looking at the menstrual cycle as a vital sign. And for my FAM practitioners, BBT analysis is one of the most important parts. I mean, they're all important, but it's one of the most important aspects of the chart because it does give us an additional measure of metabolism so that you can guide your client in terms of how much they're eating to ensure that they're getting enough overall food and protein and overall calories to support their activity level and hormonal balance and all of those things. So that's essential. It can be used to identify potential underlying issues like thyroid disorders. And also, I mean, it can tell us a little bit about what's happening in your life and whether you're getting enough sleep or how stress is affecting you, or even how allergies and different situations like that, different things that could trigger the immune system, how those types of things can affect you. And from the vital sign piece of the conversation, particularly, like I said, for practitioners to use the menstrual cycle as a vital sign and a diagnostic, the temperature is really, really helpful. From the charting perspective, of course, the temperature is really helpful to confirm ovulation. So there's a lot of really great applications for it. So I certainly am in favor of using it, but it is helpful to know that there are methods that do not use it. And it's also helpful to know that with mucus-only methods, so methods that use mucus without temperature, so, not the symptothermal method that you're probably more used to. With those methods, you can actually accurately confirm ovulation, without temperature, although I prefer, of course, to have the secondary sign, the basal body temperature, as a way to correlate the two. So I'm a fan of the cross-check to be able to confirm ovulation. But just so that you know, there are plenty of women out there using mucus-only methods who are equally confident in confirming their ovulation without it. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump into the common questions that I receive about BBT. So we'll start at the basics. One of the questions that I get most frequently in my direct messages is, what kind of thermometer do you use? What kind of thermometer should I use? And do you have a special one that you recommend? And my advice always goes like this. In order to get an accurate recording, an accurate temperature when you're charting, you don't need a fancy thermometer that is expensive in order to achieve that goal. You can accurately chart your temperature with $15, $20 thermometer. And when you're looking at a thermometer, the most basic requirement is that the thermometer measures to at least 1 decimal point. Most thermometers these days measure to 2 decimal points. So you're going to be good there. But, that's pretty much the basic requirement. So you can get it done with a thermometer that has a minimum of 1 decimal point. And then there are other features that can be helpful for you. Obviously, there are features of having a thermometer that remembers your temperature, a thermometer that has a backlight, or that allows you to switch between Celsius and Fahrenheit. And then, of course, there are a number of wearable devices, including the Temp Drop, that allow you to wear the device throughout the night. It spits out a temperature for you. It syncs to your devices, so you don't have to actually remember to, go and input it yourself manually. So there's a lot of options. But in terms of what kind, like I said, the final decision is going to be up to you. And there's a variety of reasons why you may want to choose one over the other, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. Second question that I get a lot, what is a normal pre-ovulatory temperature? So, what is that normal range? So the reason that I specify pre-ovulatory, because I don't necessarily get the question of what's a normal pre-ovulatory, I just get what are normal temperatures pre and post. But the reason I specify that is because pre-ovulation is before you have that temperature shift. So it is helpful to categorize that because you will have a different set of temperatures before and after ovulation. And ultimately, one is related to another. So if your temperatures are kind of too low pre-ovulatory, it's not like they're magically going to go so high post-ovulatory. So it is good to just, use that pre-ovulatory phase as your baseline so that you can identify if your temperatures are within that normal range. So generally speaking, before ovulation, we would want to see all of those pre-ovulatory temperatures minus your period temperatures. So during your period, temperatures are often fluctuating, a bit more erratic, higher and lower, as your hormones kind of adjust and you move back into normal cycling. So I would ignore the period temperatures for this specific piece of information here. So after your period is done, those pre-ovulatory temperatures, so the temperatures before your temp shift, before you actually ovulate, we want to see all of those temperatures ideally higher than about 97.4 degrees Fahrenheit or 36.3 degrees Celsius approximately. And so, where does that number come from? Well, we're all human beings. And so there is a normal, ideal, average temperature. I know that I hear this a lot, like, oh, I've been doing my temps for a while and I just figured my temps are just lower. And so when we're looking at the menstrual cycle as a vital sign, I mean, certainly we can have conversations about variation individually. But if you were a zookeeper and we were looking at the elephants, we wouldn't say, oh, those elephants just have a lower temperature. Like we would know that there's a certain normal body temperature for a different species. So when it comes to human beings, we shouldn't look at that differently is my argument. That's so I'm trying to make my case for this here. Basically, when the temperatures are too low, like one of the pieces of feedback that I've received on multiple occasions from my Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Workbook, which is a paper charting option for those of you who still love the paper charting. I myself personally still love paper charting, and many of my clients do also. But one of the pieces of feedback that I often get about my charting workbook is that there's a cutoff. So in the Fahrenheit book, it's 97.0. That's the lowest temperature. So if your temperature is falling below that, you have to actually write it off the chart. Similarly with the Celsius book, because it comes in both options depending on where you live. With the Celsius book, 36.0 is the cutoff. And again, if you're at like 35.9, then you are off the chart. And so I often get the like, well, where's the temperature chart for those of us who have low temperatures? And I would respond by saying, well, the reason that the chart ends is to notify you that there's a problem. If your temperatures are off the chart, so to speak, in this charting paper charting workbook example, it means that there's something going on. So whether it's that you're not taking your temperature correctly, which we can talk a little bit more about. Ultimately, for anyone who's been listening to this podcast for a period of time, you already know that I recommend holding the thermometer in place for 10 minutes before you get your temperature reading. So actually if you're using, regular thermometer and taking your temperature orally, I recommend that you hold the thermometer in place for a minimum of 10 minutes because that allows the thermometer to warm up and the temperature to stabilize, and you will get a more accurate reading. So for some women, just by doing the 10-minute rule, they're getting that BBT up to a normal range. And so they can see that there's nothing wrong. It was just the way they were taking their temperature before, because when you're using these digital temperature, like just the regular ones, it really gives you that reading within, 10 seconds or 20 seconds or whatever the case is. So there is that possibility. But for those of you who are doing the 10-minute rule and are, getting that accurate temperature, if you're doing your temperature orally, for example, which is most common, but you could do orally, axillary, which is under the arm, or vaginally. Some women opt to do that for a more consistent reading, but orally is generally the favorite. And if your temperature is still falling below that range, then that tells us something. And it can tell us that, as I alluded to before, that you're not eating enough. It could tell us that there's potentially an issue with thyroid function or nutrient deficiencies, or an issue with not getting enough sleep or what have you. So, it can tell us a lot of different things. But the first thing to know is that, if your temperature is off the chart, then that is telling us that something is going on. So the whole reason to have that cutoff being where it is to serve as a kind of a final kind of word on that, which is that if your temperature is off the chart, that we got to look at what's wrong and fix it so that we get that into the normal range here. Okay, so hopefully that is helpful. And then the question that always comes after this is, well, what's the normal post-ovulatory? Well, so it's in relation to the first one. So if the normal pre-ovulatory range, like I said, it has to be higher than about 97.4 Fahrenheit or 36.3 Celsius, then the post-op temps need to be in a higher range than that. So that could be, 97.8 Fahrenheit and higher, with at least a few temperatures hitting over that 98.0 mark. And then with Celsius, similarly, we'd expect to have some of those post-ovulatory temperatures over 36.3 36.6, 36.7. And sometimes having that temperature that hits 37.0, or at least having the temperature, one of the post-op temps hit that. So these are just general guidelines on a podcast. I'm not looking at your chart specifically. There's a lot of reasons why you could see variations there. That's why I'm doing this episode. There's tons of questions. Typically, when we're getting into the weeds about like, what about this temperature? What about that temperature? And what about this day? Those are specific questions that would have to be that pertain to you specifically. So keep in mind that this is a general information that will help you to identify some of those things. Sometimes we do have day-to-day fluctuations. That's the whole thing with temperature. There are fluctuations that we're going to see. So let's move on. So we've covered what a normal pre and post ovulatory BBT should be. Third question here: does my BBT help me to predict ovulation? So the short answer is no, it doesn't. Basically, what your BBT is, it's a measure of your baseline metabolism, and the change that we're measuring in the temperature is a result of a hormonal shift that happens after ovulation. So at the most basic level, if we divide your menstrual cycle into two halves, before ovulation and after ovulation, before ovulation, we're making a lot of estrogen as our follicles develop, as that little egg that's going to be ovulated grows. And once you ovulate, that is what triggers the production of progesterone. And progesterone raises your body temperature. It has a thermogenic effect on the body as it's preparing you for pregnancy. Essentially, it's preparing you for implantation. And there's a number of different roles that progesterone is playing during that time. But one of those roles is that it actually raises your body temperature to create this ideal temperature and environment for a fertilized egg. And so as such, what happens is we ovulate first, and then we have the progesterone rise second. And that progesterone rise is what raises our body temperature. And so that is what the BBT actually measures. When you think about that, if you haven't ovulated, you're not going to see what's called a sustained BBT shift. And basically what that is that if you're charting your temperatures, you're going to have temperatures in a certain range in the pre-ovulatory phase. We just talked a little bit about what the normal range is. And then after you ovulate, you're going to see a rise and it's going to stay high. Now, the rise on the day after ovulation isn't always exciting. Sometimes it's just rising 1 point or half a point higher than the highest of the previous. But basically what we're looking for is that shift. And so if you were to look at the chart after several days after ovulation, you would expect to see two distinct groups of temperatures where you have the first group of temperatures that is kind of lower, and then the second group of temperatures, which is higher, and you should be able to draw a line through the graph so that you have temperatures above the line and below the line. So basically the answer is no, BBT does not help you predict ovulation. It helps you to confirm ovulation. So I think that one of the best applications of BBT is that it does help you to confirm ovulation, and then you can use it to corroborate your other observations. Because these observations are hormonal, the temperature shifts should also correlate with a shift in your cervical mucus so that you can use those two signs together to confirm that you've ovulated. So that brings me to question number 4. How do I tell that I've ovulated? So when we're looking at the basic BBT rules, we're looking for 3 temperatures that are higher than the previous 6, 3 temperatures that are normal, so temperatures that are not disturbed. It's not because you had a fever or because you drank alcohol the night before, whatever. The temperature is representing like a typical temperature, and they're just higher. So now your body temperature is just higher than it was before. And that is how you confirm ovulation with your temperature. And like I mentioned, if you're also charting cervical mucus, you would be charting the lotiony white type mucus, the clear stretchy type mucus. And once you ovulate, because that progesterone did rise, because you did ovulate in this example, then the progesterone also shuts down mucus production. So some women continue to see a little bit of mucus here and there, but there's a distinct shift in terms of the quantity and quality. And in a normal typical cycle, we would expect the mucus to dry up and for you to stop seeing it after you ovulated. Okay, so next question, what do I do if my temperatures are erratic? And so erratic just means sometimes they're higher and lower, or they're kind of all over the place. And so we've covered actually a few things that can help with that already. So to reiterate, one of the first things to do if you are concerned about erratic temperatures is to consider holding the thermometer in place for 10 minutes. So what that means is you would have the thermometer off. Now, again, assuming you're using like a regular kind of oral temping thermometer here, you have the thermometer off and you place it in your mouth for 10 minutes so that it warms up. And then once that 10 minutes has passed, you turn it on and then you take your temperature. So a lot of my clients will hit the snooze button or something and then, use that 10 minutes to do this. That's one of the first things, because most of the time, especially if you've just started charting, if you're seeing temperatures that don't make sense, or up and down, all over the place, way too low, the first step is to get a better reading of the temperature, and then that helps to stabilize it so it's not all over the place. So for the majority of women that I work with, that is actually what helps. It's not to say you're never going to have a straight temperature. I can basically promise you that if you're charting with temperature, you will have at least one temperature per cycle. That's kind of weird. What we are trying to do is not to get to the point where we're not human anymore, we don't have any temperature fluctuations, but what we're trying to get to is so that we're taking the temperature as accurately as possible. Obviously opting for, a device that you can wear all night is another option. So because then the warming up issue is not really there, and that can often help to stabilize the erratic temperatures as well. But as a side note, as a second kind of thing to think about here, if you have done that already, and you are doing your 10 minutes and you've been taking your temperature for a while and you're pretty confident about that, and you're still seeing lots of ups and downs, then, there are other factors to look at. So there's many, many common factors that affect temperature. whether it's how many hours that you're sleeping at night, that can affect it. So even if you, let's say, get up around the same time, but sometimes you're getting 5 hours of sleep versus 6 or 7, that can make a difference. If you're getting up at different times, that can make a difference. So if you get up like many of us, if you get up a little later on the weekends, let's say you usually get up at 6 in the morning, and then on the weekends you're getting up at 8 in the morning or 10 in the morning or whatever, that can affect it. And some women are sensitive to things like drinking alcohol, as I had mentioned. So for some of us, if you have a glass of wine the night before, the temperature goes up. Others, it doesn't necessarily. If you have seasonal allergies, like I said, that can cause temperature shifts and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of different factors that can affect temperature. So what does that mean? Does that mean you can't live your life and you always have to force yourself to get up at 6 every day? No, I think plenty of women do that, but I would say that that's unreasonable. You don't need to do that. What I recommend in order to manage these things is to start actually tracking on your app or on your paper chart what factors affect your temperature. So for example, if you're using a charting app, most of the apps are equipped to allow you to record the time that you take your temperature each morning. So, or you can program it to kind of do that automatically. So for example, that's important if you're trying to interpret your temperatures so that you can see on the actual chart which temperature corresponds to what time you woke up. So that's something I recommend for most of my clients, to actually have that in their chart when they're looking at interpreting. Also, you can create a separate custom line to know how many hours that you slept. That's a good idea. You can have a custom line for certain things that you've noticed affect your temperatures. So like I said, whether that is alcohol consumption or other things like allergies, or if you're sick, like that kind of obvious stuff. And then you can use the comment section to record other disturbances, like if you're traveling or in a different time zone or whatever the case is. But that would be the starting point. Although it's pretty basic, I don't think a lot of us necessarily think of doing that to actually check what time we woke up to see if that corresponds with the weird temperature. When I'm saying it on the podcast, it's like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. But when you're sitting in front of your chart, seeing this weird temperature pattern, often we're wanting it to, I'm just going to share my little bias. Sometimes I think we're wanting it to mean that there's some crazy thing going on. Like, it's like we want to think that we're the exception to the rule and there's some thing happening with us. But often there's a much more basic and simple explanation for the temperature changes. So that would be my suggestions, a handful of them, for what to do if you notice that your temperatures are erratic. Today's episode is sponsored by Tempdrop. I've had so many conversations with women over the years who've had a hard time staying consistent with their temperatures. So whether you're trying to conceive, avoiding pregnancy, or charting for health reasons, Tempdrop makes fertility awareness accessible to all women, especially if you've recently had a baby and your sleep patterns are all over the place, if you work shift work and it's hard to stay consistent with temping, or if you're otherwise struggling to take your temperatures each day. Identify your fertile window in real time with Tempdrop. Know your cycle, understand your body. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/Tempdrop and use coupon code FertilityFriday at checkout for 10% off your order. That's fertilityfriday.com/Tempdrop. Now let's go ahead and jump back into today's episode. Next question, what if my temperature rises and then falls back? So that's a pretty common, thing where, you think you ovulated, the temperature goes up and then it goes back down and you're like, what's going on? So again, refer back to the previous question for that. There's a lot of reasons why the temperature could go up. Sometimes, like, to give you an example, we have a scenario where your temperatures before ovulation are fairly stable. And then you notice that one temperature is super low. And then the following day, the temperature rises a little bit. But because the temperature before was super low, it looks like this dramatic rise. So it looks like this huge shift and, I must have ovulated, right? But no, not necessarily, because if you, again, go back to the previous question, if you look at that super low temperature, maybe you got up at 5 and maybe you only had 4 hours of sleep, or maybe you were disturbed that night and you had to get up to pee 3 times, or your cat was crying or whatever. You've got all these possibilities for what could have gone on there, but sometimes we just look at the chart just as what it is and don't really consider all those other factors. So that's the first thing. In terms of confirming ovulation, ovulation, we always want to take it back to the rules. So I wouldn't only listen to this podcast and then go and like try to chart. I would get a book and a resource and work with an instructor if you're feeling you need that additional support. So there's a lot of different things you know at this point that you could do to make sure that you understand the rules. So at the most basic level, we're looking for 3 temperatures higher than the previous 6. I also teach my clients and practitioners the advanced temperature rules so that we can be a lot more clear and specific about how to confirm that ovulation in those types of situations when we want to know if the rise is enough and if what happens if it falls back down and all that kind of stuff. But basically, for the purposes of this podcast, if it doesn't meet the rules, like if you don't have 3 temperatures that are higher than the previous 6 and it's not obvious, you can't draw a line. If the temperature falls back down and continues to go up and down, like down below the line, the baseline, which would be the line that you draw between the higher and the lower. If it continues to drop below the line, you probably haven't ovulated. And I want you to just meditate on that. If the temperatures really are up and down and erratic and there's no real pattern and you can see that multiple temperatures are dropping below that line, then you probably didn't ovulate. And sometimes it's hard to get your head around because maybe you expect it to ovulate at a certain time, but that's usually the most like that. If you didn't ovulate, then you're not making progesterone. And if you're not making progesterone, you're not going to have temperatures that stay above that line. So that's the thing. This is a hormonal thing. The temperature is a reflection of what's happening hormonally. So if that's not what you're seeing, if you're not seeing a shift that stays high, then the most likely explanation is that you did not ovulate yet. It doesn't mean you're not going to ovulate. You could be ovulating right now. But in terms of the chart, that's the way to go. And so if you're using the method for birth control, you need to get a hold of the rules, take some time to learn them. Like I said, get some support, consider working with an instructor so that you can be quite clear on those rules. And if you're a practitioner working with clients and you're not sure how to interpret those charts, again, this is where training comes in really, really handy. It's not good enough to read a book and then try to work with clients because there's a lot of different scenarios that require additional training, because when you're working with clients, their charts are going to look different to yours because they might be struggling with a whole bunch of different things to you. So it is helpful to keep that in mind. But hopefully that helps in terms of what to do if your temperature rises and falls back again. So in order to confirm ovulation in that kind of scenario, you would need to wait several extra days to make sure that the temperature rise is sustained. So that's the answer to if you have ovulated and you are experiencing a weird kind of abnormal temperature, then you would have to wait until you have enough temperatures to actually confirm ovulation. So that would often mean that you have to wait a few extra days. So looking again at the temperature and cervical position, temperature and cervical mucus. And you may also want to look at other secondary signs so that you can feel really confident to confirm that you've ovulated. Okay, so I'm going to move on. What if I don't always wake up at the same time every day? So I think I've answered this question because if you think back to the previous question that I was referring to before when I was talking about what to do with erratic temperatures. So I think that the first step is just to write down what time you're waking up. So I don't think that it's necessary for you to force yourself to wake up at the same time every single day and for you to force yourself to wake up at 6 on the weekend. If you don't have to, I think sleep is also important. And in order to use your chart and to use fertility awareness, you don't need to be perfect and to always be like a robot, like I said, and wake up at the same time, whatever. But what you need to do is you need to record what's going on so that when you get to the end of your chart, you can look back and analyze it correctly. So, if you do get up at different times during the day, then I recommend that you mark down what time that you woke up and also how many hours that you slept, especially if it's not always the same. And the reason for that is just because then it helps us to interpret it, because it's much easier to interpret a chart where you actually have the times, like if it's 6 o'clock, 8 o'clock, whatever, and you happen to respond to that, and when you're waking up later, the temperatures are higher, you'll start to see that pattern, and it'll be easier to then identify what's going on there. There are certain situations that I've seen in my experience where it does get to be difficult. Ironically, when you first start charting, a lot of people really put out this idea that it has to be the same. And I have a lot of clients who'll say like, yeah, I was getting up every day to temp and then I would go back to bed. So that's kind of mindset is pretty common. I always say that charting, we shouldn't be forcing ourselves to fit into the charting scenario. The charting needs to fit into our lives. So I feel like we don't want to make it more cumbersome than it needs to be. So there's ways around that. But in general, just by noting that kind of stuff, it does make a big difference. Now, I have seen certain situations where it can be very difficult But those are more extreme situations. So when you have, like, for example, when you're working shift work, I think that's one of the questions I get a lot, like for people that are up all night and then taking their temperature at like 11 o'clock in the morning, or, 2 in the afternoon or something. So that it depends though. Sometimes that can make it more challenging, obviously, because you're getting your times at totally different times. And sometimes it's actually not as bad as you think. So the first step for someone in that scenario would be to just do it. Just take your temperature and mark everything down like I suggested and see what happens. Because I think sometimes we get in our head so much that we assume that it's going to be really bad. I've had clients who do shift work and it's not even that bad. Like when they just take their temperature, there's a couple days that are kind of weird, but that, we can allow for that, but it's actually not that bad. Other times when your temperature is like, when your schedule is that erratic, then it does make sense to consider using a wearable so that you can have some stability there. So obviously there's different options, but I would say don't just throw the baby out with the bathwater. Sometimes you just take it. Like I've had clients who they're getting woken up by their kids. They do shift work, they do all this stuff. And then when they're so convinced that they're not gonna be able to read their temperatures. And then when they actually just do it, because I just recommend just take it. Just whenever you're getting up for the day, just take your temperature. Even if it's not perfect, just do it and write a comment. And if you're being woken up by the dog or whatever, or your child, you can even have a little, line on your chart, a custom line that says like how many wake ups, and you just note how many times, or put a little angry face or a happy face, depending on how bad the night was or whatever. But there's different ways to do it. And then what I find is if you just do it, get out of your head and just do it and start marking down those different factors that can affect your temperature, then you'll start to see a pattern. So it doesn't have to be perfect in order for you to confirm ovulation. You just have to be consistent and start being able to identify the patterns that work for you. And if that doesn't work for you, like I said, there's other options like wearables that will help to stabilize that temperature. So lots of different options there. Okay. The postpartum question, what should I do? I feel like I'm addressing it as its own point, but I feel like I kind of addressed that in the previous point. So ultimately with postpartum, it's the same kind of issue. I'm in postpartum right now with my 4-month-old. However, she does sleep pretty well, so I'm not being woken up multiple times a night, which is a blessing. But, there was times when that was happening. So there's different options. When you're in the stage postpartum before your period has returned, before you start ovulating again, it does make sense, if you go back and listen to my postpartum episode, it does make sense to consider doing mucus only for a while. In order to do that, I do suggest that you work with an instructor to make sure that you're good with mucus, but that is an option. So temperature is less relevant for the purpose of charting your cycle and confirming ovulation when you're not ovulating, right? There are different strategies there. Once you do start ovulating again, once your period does start coming back, then you can look at some of those options that I talked about with the last point, which is just taking it if you can and considering a wearable if it's just too much because you have a baby now and that everything's so erratic that it just feels overwhelming. So the good news is that we do have options basically. Jumping into today's episode with some exciting news to share. The Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship Program, Class of 2023, starts in January. If you've been searching for a practical way to incorporate fertility awareness cycle charting into your existing women's health practice, then this is the program for you. The Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship is a 9-month program that provides the necessary training to incorporate fertility awareness cycle charting into your existing practice. This program cuts out all the fluff by combining the science with the practical application of charting and allows you to support your clients by monitoring their 5th vital sign in a standardized way. Finally, a program that teaches you to use the menstrual cycle as a diagnostic tool with your clients. Transform your practice in 9 months. Apply now at fertilityfriday.com/famlive. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAMMLIVE. Now let's go ahead and jump back into today's episode. Okay, so now I want to address the questions about wearable thermometers and other devices. So I'll just preface this by saying that beyond the temp drop, I have not tried every single device. I'm aware of a lot of devices. I have a lot of clients who've used a lot of devices. I will not be covering every single device because I'm not privy to all of those. I haven't tried every single one. But there is a couple general themes of wearables that you should be aware of. So one thing, Sorry, I just have to. Wearable devices you should be aware of. Ha ha ha. This is because of my children, my 10-year-old and my 7-year-old. They're always making like the dumb jokes. And so now I actually like a corny joke. So here we are. So if you didn't find that funny, my apologies. If you did find it funny, yay. We're on the same wavelength with the corny jokes. All right. One of the things to be aware of with wearable thermometers is that I think that it's helpful for this purpose of the conversation to identify the difference between different types of temperatures. So when it comes to classic charting and using the menstrual cycle as a vital sign, we are using the BBT, the basal body temperature. And that basal body temperature is a measure of your resting metabolism. So once you have what happens is when you're awake and up throughout the day, your temperature is different. And I'm not describing this the best, but when you're up and about, your temperature is going to be higher than when you're, on your bed sleeping. So in order to get that baseline metabolism, so a measure of your metabolism, what you need theoretically is a minimum of 5 hours of uninterrupted sleep. So for example, if you went to bed at 10 o'clock, assuming that you sleep all night, but I'm just going to kind of explain this here. So if you go to bed at 10 o'clock, 5 hours of uninterrupted sleep would be 3 o'clock. So assuming you're not waking up at 3 o'clock, what happens is your body kind of resets to this lowest basal temperature, if you will. And so 3 o'clock, we've got this lowest temperature. Assuming you're not getting up at 3 o'clock, each additional hour that you sleep or half hour that you sleep, your temperature creeps up a little bit. So by the time, let's say you're ready to get up at 6, then you've got a decent measure of your basal body temperature. And this is why when you're having issues with interpreting your temperature, it can be helpful to, identify what time you went to bed and also how many hours that you slept. So for example, then if you went to bed at 10 o'clock, but you got up at 4 because you had to get on the highway or something because you've got some traffic to deal with instead of 6. So then in that case, you would have had fewer hours of sleep and the temperature would, typically be a bit lower. Okay. So that is your basal resting metabolism. And that number is what helps us to identify the additional pieces of information. So the additional pieces of information, like, are you eating enough and all that kind of stuff. So that's actually a separate issue. With a lot of these wearable devices, what they're doing when you wear a device all night, some of these devices are taking kind of your temperature throughout the night and then spitting out an average temperature. And so for many of these devices, it's not actually a BBT that you're getting an average sleep temperature. So what are the pros and cons? So the pros about this is that type of temperature taking and giving you that kind of stable reading, it really does, in a lot of cases, take out some of that irregularity of the temperature. So I've seen many charts from wearable devices where wearing that device and having it kind of on your body, on your person, taking that temperature on a regular basis, that stabilizes the temperature so that when you're looking for the temp rise and looking to confirm ovulation, I've seen many times that it allows it to be more stable and easier to confirm. So that's definitely a pro. Obviously, another pro is that if you're wearing it and it's syncing to your device, it's a lot easier. A lot of us really love tech. We're on our phones all the time. We love our apps, that are recording our temperatures, and it just makes everything easier. So for a lot of us busy people, that is a great option for so many reasons. And so that is one of the reasons that I do stand behind the tech to a point, but I do stand behind that because ultimately the best way to chart your cycle and the best use of fertility awareness is the one that works for you. So what are some of the potential cons? Well, one thing that I have noticed with wearable devices is that because it's taking this average sleep temperature, if I want additional information about the metabolism and that kind of information for the purpose of deeper chart interpretation and using the menstrual cycle as a diagnostic, I will often ask my clients and practitioners to also take their oral temperature, for example. And I've had many, many clients who actually wear their device and do an oral and do both on the chart. Like that's not, both on their app. So a lot of these apps will also allow you to put in 2 separate temperatures, or on paper charting, you could use different colors or something like that. Not everybody does that. I do not ask everybody to take 2 temperatures. That is not always necessary. But at the beginning of your charting journey, if you do have concerns about a variety of kind of health related things that are tied into your charts, then that can be helpful. And what I would say is that there is a limitation with some of these wearable devices for that application of it as a diagnostic, because again, it's measuring this average sleep temperature. One of the other, so not so much with the temp drop, but there are other devices that measure your temperature from other areas of the body. So the temp drop goes under the arm. And so that's like an axillary temperature. So, it is giving you a reading that is compatible, with other types of readings. One thing in general, before I finish this point, is that the three main ways to take temperature are orally, axillary, and vaginally, as I mentioned. And so, if you're taking a temperature outside your body, it can be a little bit lower than if you were doing it orally or internally, vaginally. So that's something to be aware of as well. Like if you were to switch it up and try, this month I'm going to try doing both. I typically recommend that whatever you choose, just stick with. So if you're doing oral, just stick with oral. If you're doing underarm, stick with an underarm, because there is a bit of a temperature difference inside versus outside. And this brings me to my point. There are certain devices that you wear on you wear as a ring, on your hand, you wear on your wrist, or, whatever different places that you wear it. And when you do that, you will notice, if you've used a device like that, I'm not going to name names, but some of you know the names of some of these companies. But if you use devices like that, like if you're taking the temperature on your wrist or on your finger or something, that is actually not one of the three common ways to get your BBT. The three common ways to get your BBT are orally, axillary, and vaginally. So if you're doing it on your wrist, it stands to reason that, the temperature might be a little bit lower. So the benefit of these wearables is that they do help you to confirm ovulation. That's what we're looking for with these wearables. That's the purpose of it. The purpose of these devices is to help you confirm ovulation. So they're helping you to see the difference between the pre-ovulatory temperatures and the post-ovulatory temperatures. So even the device that you wear on your wrist or on your finger, I've seen many of those charts, and they're often quite a bit lower in terms of temperature versus the oral temps. But again, the purpose of it is not to give you information about your metabolism. The purpose of it is to confirm that difference between the pre and post ovulatory temperatures and to make it convenient for you. So you, instead of looking at the temperature range as meaningful in these cases, you're really looking for that shift and you're looking to confirm that ovulation. Of course, I recommend, if you're using a wearable device, to learn about your mucus so that you can have a secondary sign to confirm, because it is important to do a cross check, meaning to confirm that the mucus has dried up alongside the temperature shift to make sure that you have in fact ovulated. It's just as important to be accurate with these devices as without the devices. So learn a specific method, choose a method, follow it, learn the rules of that method, and incorporate the wearable device into your existing knowledge of fertility awareness. Don't just rely on the device by itself to be magical, because nothing's magical. You need to be magical. And what I mean by that is that the best application of tech to fertility awareness comes in an informed way. So I'm happy to share about tech, obviously, because I have plenty of clients who love their temp drops. So I certainly think it's a great option, or they wouldn't be sponsoring the podcast. But I think that it is important to use that with your knowledge of the method. So I've always thought the same way with all tech, whether it comes to charting apps or whatever that predict your ovulation. I don't think an app can predict your ovulation. I think that it's better because the point of fertility awareness charting is not to predict ovulation. It's to confirm ovulation and to identify your fertile days. And that's actually quite different than predicting ovulation. Identifying which days you're fertile is not predicting ovulation. It's knowing on that day that it's a fertile day and then confirming ovulation with the signs. So all that said, the takeaway here is that wearable devices can be incorporated into your charting methodology. There's a lot of great pros for using them depending on your situation. I don't think everybody needs to use a wearable device for sure, but I think that for a lot of women, for a lot of my clients, they really love having the flexibility of having this device that syncs with their apps, and they're not having to remember to take their temperature, because often people forget, and all of those kinds of things. So I think for a lot of personalities, it works really great. For other clients, they love their oral temping. And especially for those of you who are wanting to have that additional information about the basically biomarkers, about the health specifics, about the diagnostics, your metabolism levels and all of that. I think for a lot of us who want that, then the oral temps work really well with that. And like I said, I have a handful of clients who chart both. So I have a number of side-by-side charts that I've seen. And that is interesting as well, because if you do an oral temp beside some of these devices, you will notice some differences. And like I said, it could be for a variety of reasons. The first, because often these devices are doing an average sleep temperature, because they're kind of measuring that temperature throughout and giving you an average. Two, because the devices are taking your temperature from different places, like the temp drops under the arm, but other devices, wrist, hand, vagina, whatever. So you're getting different temperatures. So it would stand to reason that they may be a bit different to the oral temp. And so it is helpful to know. And different thermometers can give slightly different readings as well. If you I wouldn't recommend it, but if you had if you bought 5 different brands of temp thermometers, you would probably see that they weren't all exactly the same. And I've had clients who had a concern about their temperatures. I had a client once who was taking her temperature and they looked really high. We were kind of looking at that and having conversations about why our temperatures were so high. They were kind of a full degree, like exactly higher than they should be. We were talking about all these, could it be this? Could it be that? Do you have an infection? Do you have a fever all the time or whatever? And I said, well, before we go down that road, can you just, get a different thermometer and make sure that it's not a thermometer problem? And lo and behold, her thermometer was reading wrong. So there's all these different things to keep in mind. But hopefully this has given you some insight into the way that I think we can use tech in order to, support us and help us to chart our cycles. And especially with the temperature question, this is a question that I get a lot. And it's often hard to convey this in a, simple 20-letter response to a DM. This will be an episode that I refer to for those types of questions because it gave me the opportunity to kind of go through a few of these things in depth. Okay, so now just to recap what we talked about today, we started by talking a little bit about BBT and the different applications of it and how basically we can put the applications of BBT into 2 distinct categories. One is to just confirm ovulation, classic charting purpose. And the second is the diagnostic implications. So there's 2 separate things or 2 separate pieces of data we can gain from BBT. And it's helpful to know that as well. We talked a little bit about how not all methods use BBT and why. And with all the nuances of BBT and interpreting it and all the different things that can affect it, I do think that, there are groups of practitioners out there who don't think it's reliable. I would push back on that and say that we can interpret those fluctuations because that has been my experience throughout my career. But I do understand why people would think that because without the kind of background experience of interpreting those fluctuations, you could just throw the baby out with the bathwater and say that it's not reliable. All right. So some of the questions that we went through today, what kind of thermometer should you use? What's a normal temperature range? Will it help me predict ovulation? How do I confirm ovulation? What if your temperatures are erratic? What if we have kind of rises and falls? How do we confirm ovulation in those cases? What if you don't wake up at the same time every day, or if you do shift work and you don't have a consistent sleep pattern, which is one of the most common questions. Should you take your temperatures postpartum? How does that work? And also wearables. We went into that in a lot of depth. I hope that you enjoyed this episode. I hope you found it informative for both if you are taking your temperatures personally, if you are working with clients and trying to do chart interpretations. Hopefully this has given you some insight into why it's not always straightforward and why sometimes a person's charts can look very different to yours because as you could tell by this conversation, there's a lot of different things that can affect it. So at the time this episode is being released, it's leading up to the holiday season. So I hope that you have a wonderful holiday with your families. I hope that you are taking some time for yourself to rest and relax. If you are listening to this in real time, there is still time to join us in the 2023 class of FAM. There's still a few spots available. So for details on that, head over to fertilityfriday.com/FamLive. That's FAMMLIVE. You still have a couple weeks, if you're listening to this episode when it first dropped, to join us before the doors officially close, before our first session in the first week of January. So with that said, I hope you have a wonderful weekend whenever you're tuning into the show. And of course, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.